Good afternoon. I'm Brinton Likes, co-director with Dan Canstrom and Tim Kars and Bonnie Waldron of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice here at Boston College, where I'm also a professor of community and cultural psychology. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon, and most particularly to welcome Joe Gone, who will be with us this afternoon. As many of you know, Joe is an international expert in psychology and mental health of American Indians and other indigenous peoples. Professor of anthropology in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and also of global health and social medicine in the School of Medicine at Harvard University. He is also the faculty director of the Native American program at the university. Joe is an enrolled member of the Anahi Gros Ventre Tribal Nation of Montana, and he has also served briefly as the Chief Administrative Officer for the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. He's collaborated with tribal communities for 25 years to critique conventional mental health services and harness traditional culture and spirituality for advancing Indigenous well-being. In addition to extensive community-based engaged scholarship, Joe has published more than 85 scientific articles and chapters and received recognition for his work from a variety of different sources, including a year-long residency at the Center for Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He's received several early career awards for his emerging leadership in ethnic minority psychology, and in 2013, he was the recipient of the Stanley Sue Award for distinguished contributions to diversity in clinical psychology. And this year, the American Psychological Association has honored him with the APA Board of Professional Affairs Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions to Applied Psychology. He's currently a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and 7 divisions of the American Psychological Association. Having studied at Harvard College and the University of Illinois, he also received training at Dartmouth College and McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. We're delighted that he's been able to find some time in the midst of all of his multiple activities, including managing a household with adolescent daughters, and join us today to talk about American Indian historical trauma, retrospects and prospects. Welcome, Joe, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Professor Likes. It's really a pleasure to join the center and all of the folks who've zoomed in today to have an exchange around some of these important ideas. Let me start by saying I'm talking to you from Cambridge, Mass, and Harvard University sits on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. As the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American program, we really do try to acknowledge and render visible Indigenous peoples who sometimes don't always get the attention and limelight that they deserve. Let me start then, since I've been asked to speak only for about 25 minutes today, which is not very long to share some complex ideas. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that we can get underway here. As Professor Likes said, I'm going to talk to you today about American Indian historical trauma, retrospects, and prospects. This starts really with just the briefest of orientations to American Indian and Alaska Native peoples. We are the surviving descendants of indigenous peoples in the current day United States. From time immemorial, we've had terrific diversity in every respect of the word, whether that's cultural, whether that's religious, whether that's tribal and ethnic, et cetera. And we've experienced really a huge demographic rebound in the past century and a half from an all-time low in 1890. So prior to European arrival to the New World, quote unquote, there were perhaps 5 to 10 million indigenous peoples in what is now the contiguous United States. But that bottomed out by 1890 in the wake of colonization to a low of about 240,000 people. Fortunately, we've rebounded, as I say. So as of the last census, we're waiting on a new one now, but as of the last census, there were 2.9 million Americans who identified solely as American Indian or Alaska Native. And if you consider that mixed with other races, up to 5.2 million said they had indigenous ancestry. Importantly, we belong to 570 plus federally recognized tribal groups, although the actual number of tribal members in federally recognized tribes is probably only about 3.5 million at this point. And we live in reservation and urban population centers because of a long history of policy at the federal level that tried to relocate us from reservations to cities, predominantly in the 1950s. The important thing for purposes of today's discussion is to recognize that American Indian Alaska Native peoples are colonized peoples. That is, that we have been subject to violent dispossession throughout the history of these United States, and that history and legacy of violent dispossession has rendered large community impacts that continue to be felt today. Those impacts span all domains of life and livelihood, but they are picked up in the mental health professions in terms of what our domain tends to think of as disparities or inequities in mental health status. And what's important to note is that although there are mainstream professional, psychological, and psychiatric ways of thinking and talking about mental health inequities, Indigenous peoples themselves have an alternative or alternative set of accounts for where these come from, how to make sense of them, and what to do about them. And Indigenous historical trauma is, in fact, an alternative explanatory account for some of these conditions. The term historical trauma really started to appear with application to Indigenous populations in the United States during the mid-1990s. So you have the psychologist and public health researcher who used to be married, Ed and Bonnie Duran. They wrote a book called Post-Colonial Native American Psychology. And they also, Ed Duran in particular, published a book on the soul wound, which was the wound of colonization that he identified as really the source and origin of, psychiatric suffering of the kind that rendered Indigenous people in need of mental health treatment, counseling, et cetera, healing. At about the same time, the Lakota social work researcher, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, also coined this term historical trauma. Really, she adapted it from its use. She did some of her training in New York City with psychoanalysts who were working with offspring of Holocaust survivors, the Jewish Shoah, and they were using the term historical trauma to apply it to the Holocaust, the legacy of the Holocaust for upcoming generations. And so she said, hey, that sounds a lot like what I have witnessed among my own people, the Lakota, who were subject to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 and lots of other impacts of colonization. So she really expanded this with this term. And both Ed Duran and Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart have kind of agreed that they're talking about the same thing here. And it's not really known widely as soul wound as much as historical trauma. There have been a lot of subsequent refinements and elaborations since those early appearances in the 1990s. It's really a concept that's quite heavily promoted by Indigenous health scientists and professionals, especially in the mental health domain, or maybe a slightly broader term, the behavioral health domain. And it's really quite ubiquitous now with Indigenous communities. I think you can go anywhere in the US and in Canada, and increasingly also in Australia and New Zealand, and you will find people who are familiar with and even using this term historical trauma to describe the legacy of colonization and the mental health or behavioral health impacts that persist in our communities because of this history. So just briefly, Indigenous historical trauma at the simplest level is really a wedding of two more familiar concepts. We've, of course, talked about historical oppression for a very long time, and especially in the mental health domain, psychological trauma is a concept that's really prevalent. And so it's just a wedding together of historical trauma, historical oppression and the psychological trauma into this new term, historical trauma. The purpose of pulling this concept together for understanding Indigenous mental health issues is really to explain these health disparities that we witness in our communities, to further contextualize health problems within historical context of power asymmetries that gave rise to subjugation, dispossession, and all those sorts of things. Another function was really to resolve the kind of paralyzing self-blame that can happen to people who are caught up in addiction or violence, et cetera, who may never really think to seek help or to consider changing, taking the steps that are needed to change because they just think they're a bad person. And it's by virtue of this explanatory approach that contextualizes these problems and does so within a community experience, a collective experience, that you no longer have to think of yourself as a bad person. You could think of yourself as part of a community that's been historically wronged in these ways, and that can allow you to then take up the reins for change. And finally, it's also intended to promote and legitimate Indigenous therapeutic practices. From the beginning, whether it's Ed Duran or Maria Ayala-Horst Braveheart, they've always talked about the importance of cultural and ceremonial traditions for bringing about healing from this legacy of trauma that comes from colonization. My former grad student, Will Hartman, and I, he now teaches at the University of Washington in Bothell, have tried to characterize the 4 C's of historical trauma as it's often described or promoted. First, it originates in colonial injury. So really, as Native people talk about it, it's not like earthquakes or famines, it's the trauma associated with colonization that is carrying forward here. It is collectively experienced. It's not about this person or that person, but about entire communities. It's cumulatively escalating, which is to say that maybe the army massacred your people and then forced you onto a reservation where you then starved because you didn't have rations that were promised, and where your kids were taken away and put into industrial schools to, kill the Indian, save the man was the slogan of those schools. So, over all of these different successive experiences, this trauma accumulates is the idea. And finally, and probably most importantly, it's cross-generationally transferred. The idea of historical trauma is that ancestral suffering is somehow passed down through generational lines to create risks and disabilities for current generations. So above and beyond the direct experiences of traumatic nature that a person alive today might have, they were actually at risk or put in a vulnerable place because their ancestors suffered from these things and passed something down in this way. And so you can see that in conceiving of historical trauma for Indigenous communities, there are big implications for how we even think about mental health as a domain and mental health treatment in particular. And I already mentioned that some of what happens there is the idea that cultural and ceremonial sacred tradition are one of the components and resources available to help heal from historical trauma. This expansion of therapeutic possibilities is pretty important as one of the functions of historical trauma. So if we understand that a cultural identity looms very large in any Indigenous or Native talk about mental health conditions, it is tied really to an understanding or explanation of post-colonial anomie. Anomie is a term that means no law, which has to do with no purpose, no sense of belonging, no understanding of who you are and where you fit and what you're supposed to do in the world. And the idea is that colonization so disrupted our ways of life that we lost a lot of those kinds of guiding stars and knowing how to live your life. And that then this would give rise then to distress, dysfunction, and why we would have mental health inequities in our community associated with addiction and trauma and suicide. And so what that means is a very important key part of any healing or therapeutic effort is that of reclaiming a robust cultural identity, an identity that one can be proud of and pull into in a continuous way rather than a discontinuous way with the historical past. Therefore, it's often said to involve a return to Indigenous traditional practices in search of that continuity, in search of a robust Indigenous cultural identity. And in some respects, it even plays out around skepticism toward the latest, greatest mental health technologies and approaches that circulate, from the psychiatric and psychological establishments. Many people I know will say, we don't need the latest, greatest evidence-based practice. Our culture is our treatment. And I believe when they say that, they're really referring to this fact of, alternative Indigenous therapeutic possibilities are really what people see as remedying this legacy of historical trauma. And of course, it's tied to broader conversations or discussions concerning the decolonization of healthcare. So to summarize all this, then, historical trauma is a health discourse. It's about, behavioral health in particular, heavily influenced on mental health, addiction, trauma, suicide. It's been promoted by health researchers and professionals, and especially Native health researchers and professionals. It's focused on healing and the therapeutic, in part because that's what health researchers and professionals are concerned with, by drawing heavily on Indigenous cultural traditions and practices. And in part, that has to do with this kind of model of the injury that leads to a kind of anomie that then can be remedied through restoration to cultural identity, tradition, and practice. So clearly, I think in this discourse, you can recognize an emphasis on culture, on tradition, and on healing. And historical trauma in this sort of package has become really locally salient. As I say, it's used everywhere I go in Indian country. In fact, Will Hartman, the former student who's now a professor at Washington, he did a really nice study on a Northern Plains Indian reservation asking native service providers all about historical trauma. And even though they didn't entirely agree on what they meant by it, and it certainly wasn't exactly what scholars and professionals promote it as, they were familiar with it and used it pretty regularly. And it's also international appeal. As I said, you can find this now throughout the Kansas states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and US, and other places in the world now too. And importantly, I think it anchors a completely alternative mental health discourse. And I'll just spend a minute to tell you a little bit about that, because again, I think throughout Indigenous communities in the US, you find ways of approaching and thinking about mental health that are really parallel to, but distinctive from, stock psychiatric and conventional professional approaches to these things. So across 4 domains that we can think of, what's the nature of the problem that mental health professionals are poised to address? What is the aspiration of people in terms of seeking well-being? What is the nature of the intervention that might help to restore to well-being? And how do we evaluate approaches that are said to be helpful in terms of this restoration? I think there is an alternative Indigenous science of mental health that historical trauma helps to anchor. I say science here, you can see how I spelled it. That's a reference to the fact that psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, that these are approaches that come with certain cultural commitments, orientations, and assumptions, and they have a way of seeing the world. So labeling in this way helps to call out aspects of the constructed nature of these discourses and approaches. So in terms of the domain of the problem, we're not talking about mental disorders of the kind that you would find in the diagnostic and statistical manual, whether it's clinical depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, not nearly that so much as historical trauma in the way that I've already set forth and set out. That's really the way that people tend to talk about what is afflicting Indigenous communities that gives rise to these sorts of inequities. Again, the aspiration of what one is pursuing in terms of wellness also differs. It's not neoliberal individualism, which I would summarize as the free agents navigating free markets in pursuit of wealth and happiness, which is familiar to a swath of the American public. Not that, but really Indigenous forms of self and personhood, in which one is located within extensive webs of kinship, relationship, and obligation, and in which those kinship, obligations, and relationships extend not beyond human beings to other than human beings, whether that's spirit beings or whether that's land forms that happen to be alive, et cetera. So the aspiration is not the same as is taken for granted across many of the mental health professions. And the intervention's different, as you can imagine, as well. I already gave you a glimpse into the fact that it may not be the latest, greatest empirically supported treatments that scientists have vetted in clinical trials and shown that they help alleviate symptoms or improve functioning. Rather, it's this interest in a kind of reclaimed and revitalized set of healing practices. These are often sacred practices, ceremonial practices that have a religious cast to them, and health and help and healing are said to come from right relations with spirit powers and so on, in a way that these ceremonies partake. Just from a more psychological frame of reference, it's also the case that participation in those things is understood to remedy this sense of post-colonial anomie. So you can talk about the psychological implications outside of that religious or spiritual domain as well. Finally, in the domain of evaluation, which is to say the domain in which one wonders, how you would assess whether something works or not that one is trying in terms of remedying mental health inequities. I haven't found a great deal of enthusiasm or openness to, scientific approaches for studying these things in the way that psychiatric scientists and clinical scientists study these things. Basically, Indian country is not really clamoring for, more scientists and more scientific studies. It's really Indigenous ways of knowing that are on the ascent in terms of thinking about these things. Indigenous ways of knowing has been promoted, I think, first and foremost in academia by Native American and Indigenous studies scholars. It's still rising. We're still sorting out all the ins and outs of that. But the idea here is that there are alternative sort of epistemological orientations that give rise, that there are some traditions around knowing and knowledge that persist in our communities, and figuring out what those are and what they imply about everyday life today in our communities, how they might be harnessed for academic knowledge production is all part of this endeavor. And I'll just say simply that the biggest difference, I would say, between scientific approaches and these indigenous ways is that in some ways the highest, from a traditional perspective, some of the highest authority for knowledge is not science or any kind of abstract rationalist approach. Rather, it's more personal experience, firsthand personal experience. There's really, in many instances, no higher authority that you could make a claim other than I did this and here's what happened, and therefore I feel this about that experience. Well, I'm trying to keep this short, so I'm not going to go too much into a recent systematic review that I and my former students published together around the health impacts of historical trauma. The point, I guess, is it has been studied, and I think we found 32 studies at that time that showed, links between people's endorsing historical trauma and, adverse health outcomes. But the problem with that research is that it really is not streamlined well enough so that the assessment of historical trauma necessarily makes a lot of sense in terms of accounting for this. This has to do with some limitations of the way historical trauma has been operationalized for purposes of assessment. We could talk more about that in the exchange if you'd like. But suffice it to say that I'm not sure that historical trauma's major function in the world right now is as a scientific construct that one could study in ways that would allow you to make robust claims about mental health inequities arising from ancestral suffering, for example. I think it's much more a figurative use. In some ways, it's a metonym, which is to say that experiences of ancestral suffering that get classed as historical trauma are really standing in for this legacy of colonization more generally. And it's really the legacy of colonization that people are really advancing through this term as a way of framing and talking about mental health inequities in the way I've already kind of reviewed. Why have we made this shift to historical trauma? Why don't we just say colonial legacy, or why don't we use older ways of talking about social determinants of health, poverty, oppression, racism, those sorts of things? Well, I think historical trauma at the time it started to arise is really a novel foundation for making claims. And so one thing to recognize is that anytime you're engaged in trying to advocate and advertise one's situation and are pursuing justice and healing, you need a language in which to do that that will have a compelling impact on some audience. And our terms and our language can start to wear out or wear thin or become old hat or seem too familiar. So we're in this situation where we're always obligated to kind of reinvent the language we use. And psychological trauma became one way to make sense of this that had currency at the time it arose and still has currency today. So psychological trauma originated in the 1860s in Great Britain. And before then, trauma just meant physical injury, like a wound. It only became to mean a psychological wound in the context of high-speed railway accidents that were happening for the first time with the steam-driven locomotive in Britain at that time. What would happen is these trains would sometimes crash, run off the rails, people would be thrown about inside the cars, stumble off the wrecked train, and have problems, symptoms. And the symptoms were looked or thought to be neurological potentially, but of course they couldn't identify any biological anomaly that might account for these symptoms. So the supposition was there could be psychological wounds or injuries from having gone through the shock of such an experience. And so that's how people started to think about psychological woundedness as trauma instead of just a physical wound. But what's important to note here is that even back then, claims about psychological trauma were always intimately tied with claims making. So if you got injured in a train wreck and had symptoms they couldn't find a biological cause for, you still might want to make a claim to the train company that you were owed damages or some kind of reparations. And so, being able to demonstrate or to have a compelling argument made on behalf of psychological wounds was tied into the idea that there could be compensation for that sort of thing. And psychological trauma has been linked to claims making of this sort ever since. It entered the DSM-3 in 1980 through advocacy of Vietnam veterans who were coming back from the war. And of course, when Vietnam veterans who came back from the war were diagnosed with this new disorder, PTSD, they could make claims to the government to have monthly payments for disability. And so psychological trauma, everywhere you see it deployed, it's often a means to have a compelling case, often before courts or adjudicating bodies of various kinds. If you're seeking international asylum, you might want a diagnosis of PTSD if you experience torture, for example. It's just ways of bolstering the claims you might make. So historical trauma, I am submitting to you, harnesses this function of claims making by psychologizing the oppression of Indigenous peoples. In that sense, it's an invention of our times in the sense of circulating with the notion of psychological trauma much more broadly, which really did start to take off in the 80s and 90s. And so this appeal of historical trauma for Indigenous communities, was sort of ushered in by that same circulation of what anthropologists like this have called the empire of trauma, as this circulated through the globe, really, as people took this up. And therefore, it allows for intergenerational psychic injury as a form of justification for potential damages and reparations. Now, Indian people have been making claims for damages and reparations for a very long time. The American Indian movement of the late 60s and early 70s, or throughout the 1970s, made lots of claims based on treaty rights and giving land back and so on. But, they didn't use the terms of psychological injury because that really wasn't, well circulated and a meaningful concept at the time. It's only as this has come online in broader cultural circulation that it has made sense to ground one's claims for damages and reparations in this context of ancestral suffering that gives rise to a kind of ongoing psychic wound. And therefore, historical trauma affords, I'd say, a novel rhetorical strategy for these long-standing demands by Indigenous peoples for remedy and redress. So I hope this helps to frame a little bit of my account for why I think historical trauma has become the way we think and talk about these sorts of things within the broader cultural currents of how one makes claims in the world and tries to justify and provide a rationale for why repair is on order. Now, the dilemma I feel, especially as a psychologist who's attuned to what psychocentric self-orientations might mean more broadly and the medicalization that can happen through clinical approaches, is I think there are unforeseen consequences that we haven't taken enough stock of. So one thing that this historical trauma approach does is it tends to essentialize indigeneity. Basically, everyone who's Indigenous is understood to have suffered from historical trauma, to be at risk, to have been wounded. And in that sense, it's not been adopted in a way that, we think about this small subset of our communities who suffer from historical trauma, or some communities who experienced these sorts of horrific colonial events 150 years ago versus those who experienced them 350 years ago. Like no one's trying to parse out if there's any difference between that, or whether some families who directly experienced, horrors of colonization might have a different profile than other families who weren't there themselves. No one's really looking into this. Really, it's just a blanket assertion that Indigenous people suffer from historical trauma, which I think tells us something about the function of this discourse. Again, back to the issue of whether it's a scientific construct or more a figurative metonym standing in for just the legacy of colonization more general. But I think there are dangers to essentializing indigeneity in this way, because as we always say, there's a great deal of diversity, and we have different histories, and those histories played out in different ways. It also participates in biologizing suffering. The greatest enthusiasm for historical trauma comes from folks who think that epigenetics is really the way to make sense of and understand how it is that ancestral suffering could be passed down the generational lines to put current generations at disadvantage or risk. And so there are potentials that come with biologizing suffering, but drawbacks too. And the concern, of course, is like we thought when we said that, thinking about mental illness as a brain disorder might relieve stigma, in actuality, it increased stigma. So these things are kind of hard to really understand. The other thing is indigenous populations are always interested in advancing their own interests in self-determination and expressions of sovereignty. And if you're at the same time claiming that you suffer from biological injury of the sort that's passed down, that's sort of at odds with trying to claim that you're more able to control your own destiny than you do currently. So I think there could be unforeseen consequences that way. Finally, it's medicalizing the social. This has to do with taking, histories of injustice and turning them into medical problems that doctors and clinicians can treat at an individual basis. So instead of looking to unjust social systems and trying to transform those systems toward justice, it becomes really ultimately about healing individuals. And that has concerns, of course, if you are trying to think about structures of oppression and how you might transform those structures toward greater equity. If you end up medicalizing them and therefore giving it into the domain of clinical repair so that it's individuals being changed by their therapists rather than society being transformed in ways that are more just. All of this, I think, has real implications for what we might think of as reparations. And I think that's what in part we want to talk about together. So I'm going to end now in order to allow us to enter into a period of audience exchange. So before I do, I'll just point you to my website. I have almost all of my publications are here available for free download, and you can read more about the work that I've done. Historical trauma is sort of just one domain that I've focused on. Although I will say that probably the highest citations to my articles are those articles that have focused on historical trauma because it is such an important concept at this moment for mental health and so on. So thanks for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get rid of these slides, and then we'll go ahead and take some audience comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was an extraordinary presentation. Having read a chunk of your work, I am deeply impressed by the ability to incorporate a number of critical insights. And I want to dive into the final question about reparations, but I'm going to give the floor to a couple of questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time to come back to that question. There's one question about whether or not you could elaborate a little bit more. Now, it was posted somewhat in the midst of your presentation, but exactly what you mean by decolonization of healthcare. And I'm going to link it to another question, which comes from someone who's writing from Iximuli, or what is now Guatemala, and thinking about whether or not you see the concepts you've presented that speak to the experience of Native Americans and Native Alaskans as applicable to Mayan communities. I'm wondering what are some of the pros and cons of adapting this notion of historical trauma to another context, and if there's a danger in claims making using historical trauma to psychologize the oppression of indigenous communities, which I think you touched on in your final comments. But maybe those two questions, and then there are a number of others. But in general, the comments are that this has been brilliant and mind altering. So with that.
Well, that's mind altering. Okay, well, let's start with decolonization. So in part, I'm reporting that this has often been folded in and seen to be part and parcel of a decolonization agenda within healthcare. I'm not someone who often talks about the importance of decolonizing healthcare, in part because as Native peoples, we've been warned by some of our peers and colleagues at other universities to be wary of adopting the term decolonization as a metaphor for anything except land and repatriation of land or rematriation of land and control over land or territorial authority. So on the one hand, I think what people mean is that healthcare is set up under the usual kinds of limitations of biomedicine, which has worked wonders in some respects, but is limited in other respects. And I think people feel that biomedicine and how it's provided and offered and funded and everything else is so seriously limited that it can't really remedy some of the inequities that are in deep need of remedy. And so the idea of decolonizing healthcare is trying to rethink the very basic organizing factors of biomedicine toward greater justice in the field and domain of health. So that's, I think, what people mean by it. In terms of adapting to other contexts, it has been adapted to lots of contexts already, and I presume it will continue to spread for a time. Maybe at some point we'll need a new language, as I said, to get people's attention again. But right now, I think it's continuing to spread. Pros and cons, I think I tried to lay those out. I do think there are serious cons. I don't really understand what's wrong with the colonial legacy as a way of time, or post-colonial distress, which has the benefit of focusing in terms of post-colonial on the now as much as on history. And in terms of distress, doesn't really presume woundedness or injury or pathology. I mean, it's distress, and there's other options too, I think. You could talk about grief, post-colonial grief. Grief is normative. Everyone goes through grief at times in their life, so there's no danger of pathology there at all. You could talk about being aggrieved, which has to do with like feeling wronged and feeling like you need remedy for that. You could talk about resistance, which is a different way to respond to a history of oppression, which might pursue justice, much more than healing. So I think what's at stake here is whether your aim is primarily healing or primarily justice. And of course, those aren't mutually exclusive, but if you had to accent one or the other, I guess I'm someone who thinks that healing is more likely to follow in the wake of justice, in comparison to justice necessarily following in the wake of healing.
Thank you. So there are a number of questions. A number of people comment that they'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about reparations. One person makes a link between the Black Like Me or Black Lives Matter movements and Native peoples, and to what extent you might see connections there. And then another question, which I think links to that, which I have in thinking about your 5 C's, and particularly your comment just now about decolonization, which reminded me of Eve Tuck's notion that decolonization is not a metaphor, that it does have to do with territories, and the question about Guatemala, where my own experiences with indigenous peoples is that the territories and the land have enormously important significance in this notion of community and this notion. And so I'm just wondering, thinking about the 5 C's, the sort of territory and land doesn't emerge in quite the same way as I hear it in some of that struggle. And I'm wondering if the history of US colonization and thinking about colonization in places like Guatemala are sufficiently different that the territories and lands have different significances, or sort of how you see that fitting into the reparations issue.
Yeah, sure. Well, I do think that reparations for indigenous peoples is often fundamentally about land and restoration of lands and control over lands. And I think that's what lots of indigenous communities, polities, governments really want, is to not only preserve their land, but to get land back. And I think of like the great Oneida Indian comedian Charlie Hill, who half of his jokes were all about land all the time. It's really important. So I think you can't overestimate that. The importance of land. I also think that that's, one of the problems with either thinking about decolonization as a metaphor in the way you're referring to, and which I was referring to before, and also in terms of, historical trauma as a way of accounting for all this, is it doesn't really take much stock of the material. Things like land, although in indigenous communities, land isn't only material. So there's more to it than that. But I think one link that can be drawn is there's increasing attention to healing approaches that are land-based, that involve getting people out onto the land, getting more intimately acquainted with the land in a way that their ancestors might have been. So the last thing I'll say about the reparation is probably the single greatest act of reparation that the United States have made for indigenous peoples was that for almost 40 years it operated the Court of Indian Claims, in which the federal government basically waived its sovereign immunity to protect itself from lawsuit, to say, here, come before this court, make your land claims, we're going to settle up for the injustices that we've done in the past. And hundreds of tribes came forward with lawyers and anthropologists and historians to make the case for what their land had been taking. Now, the limitation is the Court of Indian Claims, like in the US in general, only gives you money, doesn't give you land back. So, tribes were in a bit of a dilemma about whether to take money or not. Many hundreds did and settled the claim by taking the money. Others haven't. The Lakota people, the Great Sioux Nation, North and South Dakota, They want the Black Hills back. They have $1 billion sitting in an account that was awarded by the federal government for theft of their lands, and they won't take it because they want the Black Hills back. So, reparations has limits in terms of how it's been done. And yet, I think you'd be hard pressed to find any nation on the planet that has done something like the Court of Indian Claims to try to settle up with the theft of lands to its indigenous peoples. Now, in terms of land and territory around more generally, I do think that that's the kind of thing. I don't know how historical trauma fits into land and territory. You can make it fit, you can kind of motivate and frame it around land and territory, but it seems to me that claims for land and territory are kind of a different variety than claims that I've been wounded and injured and need money, which is usually what the courts award if you have injuries or damages.
Thank you very much. There are quite a number of other questions. Let me go to one, which is a question about your reference to the Jewish historical trauma issue in the Holocaust. And the commentator observes that US Jews today don't face the same existential threat from anti-Semitism as they did in Europe during the Holocaust, nor the particular trauma that you're describing in terms of indigenous communities. She asked, can history be used or abused to perpetuate traumatization and to prevent healing?
I mean, I think indigenous people often feel like Americans in general are miseducated about us by the virtue of every Thanksgiving, primary schoolers, do the turkey feather headdresses and play pilgrim and Indian and come to believe that, anyway, the usual kinds of stuff that is heavily stereotyped and often inaccurate. And the broad notion of playing Indian is another way these stereotypes get played out, whether it's cowboys and Indians as children, or whether it's this long history of Americans at key moments playing Indian in the way my colleague Phil Deloria has written about. The Boston Tea Party, they played Indian to throw the tea overboard and reject the king's authority and so on. So Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of America, that's a huge entryway that gave rise to mascots of Indian people at sports teams at universities and in professional football teams. We are stereotyped all the time in very publicly visible ways that no one even bats an eye at. And my best example of this is to go get the Walt Disney film Peter Pan, the animated cartoon for kids. Walt Disney made lots of cartoons were deeply racist at the time in the 40s and the 50s. But the ones that really did stereotypical caricatures of Black people are all but erased from public life. But you can buy Peter Pan off the shelves in Best Buy right now and watch the most horrific stereotypical portrayal of Indian people as possible, and people don't bat an eye. So there is a difference in that respect that I think we're such a small population, we're battling for greater voice and visibility, and people are miseducated all the time with respect to our issues.
That's a really important set of questions that I think dovetails with a question from someone who says that as a counselor who hopes to work with indigenous communities, do you have recommendations for how I can go about learning how to be part of the push to decolonize mental health?
Yeah, so, when it comes to trying to pursue remedies or reparations or an alternative way of doing things, it starts first and foremost with relationships with indigenous peoples themselves. There's no way that any outsider can just take it on themselves to decolonize anything necessarily and go about it without a relationship, without a partnership, without consultation and accountability and all that sort of thing. So first and foremost, what you need to do is have relationships with living, breathing Indian people, some of whom are in a community you might like to work with, where you can learn these things. And, that's not the way mental health professional jobs are often thought of or how people are hired. So what that means is, if you're hired into such a position, you've got to take time, usually at your own leisure time, to make those efforts, because most jobs don't say, here's a week to get out in the community and really get to meet people and understand what's happening. So it's an effort, it's above and beyond, what the job description will say, but there's no such thing as decolonization or anything emancipatory like that doesn't first and foremost depend on relationships with living, breathing Indian people who you can talk to and learn from, and whose wishes you can respect, and whose causes you can champion at their invitation and their invitation only, and in general, who can help you to enter into an accountability with people who have their own say and their own stakes and their own issues.
Thank you. This question comes, related to your important comment about not essentializing indigeneity, and the question has to do with your thoughts about how to acknowledge the diversity of histories and experiences among Indigenous peoples and avoiding essentializing while also maintaining solidarity in the interest of reparations, especially since traditionally reparations claims tend to be individually focused, tied to specific harms, and don't allow for collective reparations typically.
Yeah. Well, reparation to a tribe is still a collective reparation, even though it's to a single government maybe, or a single polity that's been recognized in certain ways in federal law and policy. So it's still collective, but I get the point. And I don't know if it's really that reasonable or realistic to expect reparations that involve real resources to be, generally allocated without sussing out the details and the distinctions among and between peoples. But there's one example perhaps from Canada that's worth mentioning is, of course, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was appointed, and that heard testimonies from survivors of the industrial or residential schools, as they call them there, who were abused in all kinds of ways. And they lasted for many years. And the reparation they offered in the end was payments to former students of these schools who were abused, depending on the number of years there, and sometimes depending on how horribly they were abused. That's an example of a kind of repair that is more general because, it was payments to individuals, but, and it did depend a little bit on the individuals, but there were general policies that governed the whole thing. So maybe that's one way to start to split the difference there. It's important to acknowledge, though, that the boarding schools, which were invented here in the United States, were reformed pretty substantially in the 1930s, and that's different than what it was in Canada, where they existed in an unreformed state really quite recently. So the US and Canada are different with respect to that. I don't know what a boarding school healing project would look like here, given that's been so much more time since they were reformed, although there is such an effort, and there are Native people talking about what it might look like.
Thank you. This is a question from a professor who says, on the one hand, thank you for the outstanding presentation, and keeping in mind the tensions and disconnects between psychological science and Indigenous healing practices and ways of knowing that you have persuasively articulated, do you see a role for psychological science in the health, healing, reparations, and/or justice for Indigenous people? And if you do see a role for psychological science, what might it look like?
Yeah, so, I am have a doctorate from the clinical community psychology program at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, which is a clinical science program. And so I do identify as a clinical scientist in some respects, even as the things that I do are really outside of the general purview of what's recognizable among that broader movement. So I think there are ways to innovate and adapt and tailor that can look quite different than, what the source and more common approaches might be. But again, this goes back to the same issue with the reparations question, which is, what does it look like? Well, it depends on the community partners you're working with and what they want to see happen. So if you go to my website, you'll find a couple of papers I've written. One is on the Blackfeet Culture Camp. This was an alternative to addiction treatment as usual that I put together with Blackfeet partners from the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, which was designed to, instead of taking the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous as the foundation for addiction treatment, to take Blackfeet therapeutic tradition as the foundation for treatment and figure out what that might look like if you're going to try to reach Blackfeet clients in addiction treatment with a different kind of approach. And that kind of approach looks very different. Doesn't look anything like addiction treatment in general or psychotherapy or anything like that. Similarly, I took a partnership with the Urban Indian Health Clinic in Detroit, where they were interested in integrating traditional healing practices into the services they offer. I have a few manuscripts or articles about that you can look at. Once again, it was about trying to expose urban Indian people who were cut off from some of these sacred ceremonial traditions into the sweat lodge ceremony, into all the components of the sweat lodge ceremony, all prayer and offerings and the different ceremonial components. That's what they wanted. That wasn't the most fundable thing. It wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do most, but that's what these partnerships look like when you're an outsider coming in working with partners. And that's how we remedy the history of alienating, irrelevant, and sometimes exploitative research that had happened with Indian communities. It's not what we want or we think, it's how we partner with and can show respect for and offer communities what they want.
Another thing that occurs to me listening to you is in a different domain intellectually is some of the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer and indigenous members of indigenous groups who are also scientists, botanists, and who write at the interface of botany and traditional. I heard an incredible lecture recently on pecans, in which she tracked the role of pecans in her indigenous community and the forcing people off the lands in Oklahoma and sort of moving north. And it was fascinating. It was an extraordinary example of bringing sort of a scientific approach and an indigenous and an historical trauma approach to the. Another question that, not to distract with some of my own connections, comes from someone who wants to know if you could speak a little bit more specifically about Indian ways of knowing, or how you might characterize this kind of epistemology. We heard a talk several weeks ago about, through the Columbian Truth and Reconciliation process, about epistemologies of the South, or someone wants to know if you could distinguish what she calls, or she calls Western epistemologies from other epistemologies that might be more characteristic of indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I think I could characterize what some indigenous scholars have said about this, because I myself am still sorting through, what the ins and outs might be. And I worry that sometimes that language is a little essentializing, especially when we talk about things like at the epistemology, like that's huge. I don't know. So epistemological, I'll use as an adjective is okay, I guess. And in that respect, Marlene Brandt Castellano, a Mohawk scholar in Canada, talked about indigenous ways of knowing as being oral, experiential, narratively conveyed, personal, so aspects that, are, I think, probably readily associated with the oral tradition in many respects. And I've written about this. If you want to know more what I think about it, you can go to my website and get a couple articles about it. But I think one of the sets of things it implies is, how do you take that and make it applicable to academic knowledge production, which of course is heavily literate and originates in literacy. And literacy is very different than orality, as scholars have talked about for a long time. So these are different kind of modes of knowing. One other thing I'll say is, I'll just give an example from my own community, my ancestors. If they needed to know something, like they lost something of great value, or they wanted to know if an enemy was coming to attack them as they were camped out, they had a ceremony to call a ghost, which was, an ancestor or someone from the community who had passed on. And the ceremony would be done at night. They could call the ghost would come, they could ask the ghost questions, the ghost could go away, travel away, find out the answer, come back, give the answer. So I'm not being facetious when I say that, to me, is a kind of indigenous research methodology of a sort, but of course it's not one that's necessarily acceptable or relevant in academic knowledge production as universities are organized today. But I don't think we want to overlook the importance of that kind of approach to knowledge, which gives all kinds of insights and windows into what the different foundations of such knowledge might look like.
Well, with deep respect for your caution that we not essentialize this notion of different epistemologies, it reminds me a little of Del Sousa Santos, who once wrote that if he wants to go to the moon, he'll take the epistemologies of the North, but if he wants to save the Earth and all of our systems of beings, he'll take what he calls the epistemologies of the South. So I respect those examples. Here's another question taking us back to reparations, and asks, how can reparations for historical trauma be made in a way that is not biologically? That is, if people today are not themselves experiencing the type of abuse that they experienced historically. Not quite sure I fully understand the question myself, but I think it's a connection to...
It's back to, how do we account for the fact that ancestral suffering could put current generations at risk when, above and beyond their own personal firsthand experiences of suffering, of injury, of colonial assault or subjugation. And the explanation of epigenetics is the biological attempt to make sense of that. But, proponents of indigenous historical trauma have not solely relied on biological. They speculated there could be spiritual wounds that are passed along in that sense. Or, of course, there's all kinds of other ways you could talk about parenting, there are obvious psychosocial things that could pass along. Although the difference is that we already have accounts and ways of talking about, if I'm abused by my parent and I go on to abuse my kids, that's perfectly sensible. Everyone kind of, in fact, people tend to believe that so much, they believe it above and beyond what's probably real, how often that really happens. So, but that's so mundane that it's not even worth it. It's really the fact that it's tacit, implicit, there's some hidden passing along of these things that is evocative. And that's where epigenetics comes in for some real enthusiasm, but epigenetics has a ways to go before it can really bear that particular explanatory burden. We don't have human studies that go generations back to, you think about the Pequot Indians, there are Pequots today here in New England, they were massacred at Fort Mystic, and I think it was 1300 something. No, 1500, 1530, 1530s, I think it was. That's a long time ago to have an event of that sort. And the idea of historical trauma is that might have passed down the generations to keep Pequots today at risk. So if you're going to take that seriously as a scientific claim, there's just all kinds of things that people really haven't unpacked who advocate for these ideas. And I don't really know how epigenetics could account down that line when those people have intermarried the survivors have intermarried for so long. It's kind of overwhelming to even figure out how you would parse that out.
That may be a very provocative and challenging comment to end us on. This has been an extraordinary opportunity, and it's really wonderful of you to take the time to share with a very large audience here who deeply appreciates and thanks you for your contributions. I realize I forgot to share with everyone that this event was also co-sponsored by the Applied Developmental and Educational Psychology program at Boston College, and also with the Psychological Humanities and Ethics Initiative here at BC. So there are many paths before us. And thank you so much, Joe, for being with us today. And once we are liberated from these screens, the Charles River always seems like it's much wider than it actually is, but hopefully
Yeah.
we will be able to cross that bridge and see each other face to face as we move forward. And thanks
Well,
for
I'm
your
very
presence.
grateful. It's been a lot of fun, and my apologies to the Pequots for not getting their history and dates right. But in any case, thanks so much. And I hope that this has rounded out and, provoked some of you to think about these issues in a way that hopefully is generative. So it's been
I
a
think
real
it has.
Thanks
most
so much.
definitely. Thank
Good to
you.
spend time with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.